I was already an adult when my mother finally said it out loud. Not with anger, not with shame. She said it calmly, like she was stating a simple fact. "I knew what he did," she said. "I just needed you to stay quiet." That was the moment I understood something I had avoided my entire life. My silence was never about protecting me. It was about protecting her. For years, people told me I was lucky. Lucky to grow up in a stable home. Lucky to have a mother who kept the family together. Lucky to have a childhood without scandal, without police, without broken reputations. What they never saw was the cost. What they never asked was, who paid for that peace? Because while the house stayed quiet, I didn't. I just learned how to disappear inside myself. The man who hurt me was someone my mother trusted. Someone she invited back into our home, again and again. Someone she defended when I was barely old enough to understand why my body froze every time I heard his voice. And when I finally found the courage to tell her, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't ask a single question. She told me to be careful. She told me not to exaggerate. She told me that talking about it would destroy the family. That was the day my mother made her choice. And it wasn't me. If you've ever been told to stay silent for the sake of the family, if you've ever felt like your pain was inconvenient, if you've ever wondered how a parent could protect the wrong person and still sleep at night, then stay with me, because this story isn't just about what happened. It's about what happens after. It's about the long years of silence, the quiet manipulation, and the moment when the truth almost came out, but didn't. It's about the day my mother needed me and expected my silence one last time. And before we go any further, I want to say this. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that truth deserves a voice, even when it makes people uncomfortable, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. That way, even if life pulls you away, these stories and many others like them will be here waiting for you. Now let me ask you something. If the person who was supposed to protect you is the same person who asked you to stay silent, do you still owe them your loyalty? Because what my mother didn't know then, what she would learn much later, is that silence doesn't last forever. And when it finally breaks, it breaks everything. People used to say we were a good family, not perfect, just solid. The kind of family neighbors pointed to when they talked about stability. We lived in a quiet neighborhood where lawns were trimmed every weekend, and everyone waved, but never really asked questions. My mother liked it that way. She believed privacy was the same thing as dignity. She worked hard, kept the house clean, and made sure appearances were always in order. Birthdays were celebrated on time. Holidays were never missed. Bills were paid. Smiles were practiced. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. My mother had a phrase she repeated often. "We don't air our dirty laundry." She said it like it was wisdom, passed down through generations. Like silence was a form of strength. I learned early that being a good child didn't mean being happy. It meant being easy. It meant not asking questions that made adults uncomfortable. It meant understanding when to stay quiet. There was one rule in our house that mattered more than any other. Family comes first, no matter what. At the time, I thought that rule meant protection. I didn't realize it also meant sacrifice. The man who would later change everything was someone my mother trusted completely. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't some shadowy figure from the outside world. He was someone she welcomed, someone she defended, someone she told me to respect. When he was around, my mother seemed relaxed. She laughed more. She talked about how lucky we were to have people we could rely on. And I watched all of it from the side, quiet, observant, already learning how to disappear when things felt wrong. There were moments back then that didn't make sense to me. A hand lingering too long, a look that made my stomach tighten. The way my body reacted before my mind could explain why. But I didn't have the words, and even if I had, I wasn't sure I was allowed to use them. In our house, discomfort was treated like bad manners. If something made you uneasy, the polite thing to do was ignore it. If something felt wrong, you assumed you misunderstood. My mother was very good at that, at reframing things, at smoothing edges until nothing sharp remained. She believed families stayed together because people chose not to look too closely. She believed that love meant endurance, and that pain, if left unspoken, would eventually fade. I believed her, because children always do. I learned to read the room before I spoke, to watch her face carefully and decide which version of myself was safest to present. The quiet one, the agreeable one, the one who didn't complicate things. And so, when unease turned into fear, I swallowed it. When confusion turned into dread, I smiled instead, because nothing in my upbringing suggested that my feelings mattered more than the family's image. What hurts the most looking back is how normal everything felt, how ordinary. There were no alarms, no obvious warnings, just a slow, steady lesson that my comfort came second. The family everyone envied was built on something fragile. Not love, not trust, control. And at that point in my life, I didn't know it yet, but my role had already been decided. I was the one who would adapt, the one who would endure, the one who would stay quiet, so everyone else could stay comfortable. And that silence would follow me for years. I don't remember the exact day everything changed. There was no single moment that announced itself as important, no clear line between before and after. It was quieter than that. I just remember the feeling, the way my body reacted before my mind could catch up, the sudden tightness in my chest, the urge to leave the room without knowing why. He was around more often then, not every day, but enough that his presence became familiar, predictable, and somehow unavoidable. My mother trusted him. That part was always clear. She spoke about him with certainty, with confidence, as if his character was beyond question. Be polite, she would say. Be grateful. He's family. I tried. At first I thought the problem was me, that I was too sensitive, too shy, too uncomfortable in my own skin. Because nothing obvious happened. Nothing you could point to and say, there, that's it. Just moments that lingered longer than they should have. Conversations that made my throat feel dry. The way he watched me when he thought no one else noticed. And the way my mother never noticed at all. One evening stands out more than the others. It wasn't dramatic. Just an ordinary night like so many before it. My mother was busy in another room. The television was on. The house felt calm. Too calm. I remember sitting there telling myself to relax. Telling myself that nothing was wrong. That I was imagining things. And then something shifted. Not loudly, not violently. Just enough to make my heart start racing. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I froze. That was the first thing I learned about fear. It doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like stillness. When it was over, nothing looked different. The room was the same. The noise from the television hadn't changed. But I had. I didn't know what to call what I felt. I only knew I didn't want to be alone anymore. So I went to my mother, not to accuse, not to explain, just to be close. She noticed something was off. She always did. But instead of asking what happened, she asked what was wrong with me. You seem tired, she said. You're probably just stressed. I wanted to say something then. I really did. The words were right there, heavy, pressing against my chest. But I didn't know how to arrange them in a way that wouldn't cause damage. And somewhere deep inside, I already understood that damage was not allowed. So I nodded. I agreed. I apologized, and she accepted that explanation with relief. After that, things changed in small ways. He was around even more, and my mother encouraged it. He helps out, she said. He's good to us. Each time she said it, I felt something inside me sink lower. I started avoiding certain rooms, keeping doors open, timing my movements carefully. I learned how to make myself invisible. There were nights I lay awake, replaying everything, wondering if I had misunderstood, if I had somehow invited it, if I was overreacting, because no one else seemed concerned. And in my world, concern only existed when it was shared. The most confusing part was my mother's behavior. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't angry. She was simply unaware or pretending to be. And I couldn't tell which was worse. By then, I had learned something important, something I would carry with me for years. If something bad happened and no one else acknowledged it, then maybe it wasn't real, or maybe it was only real to me. And that realization was far more frightening than anything he had done. I didn't tell my mother right away, not because I didn't want to, but because I was waiting for the right moment. I kept telling myself there would be a day when everything felt calm enough, a day when she wouldn't be tired, a day when the house felt safe. That day never came. What finally pushed me wasn't courage. It was exhaustion. Carrying something alone for too long changes you. It makes you smaller, quieter, and eventually, it makes silence feel heavier than truth. I remember the afternoon clearly. It was ordinary, too ordinary for what I was about to say. My mother was sitting at the table sorting mail, bills, flyers, the routine pieces of a normal life. I stood there longer than necessary, trying to find the right words, trying to arrange them in a way that wouldn't explode once they left my mouth. When I finally spoke, my voice didn't sound like mine. I need to tell you something. She looked up annoyed, more than concerned. What is it now? I started slowly, carefully, not naming him at first, not accusing. I told her how uncomfortable I felt, how afraid, how certain moments made me freeze. She listened without interrupting. No anger, no shock, just a tight expression I couldn't read. When I finally said his name, the room felt smaller, like the walls leaned in to listen. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she sighed, not in disbelief, not in horror, in irritation. She asked a few questions, but not the ones I expected. She didn't ask what he did. She didn't ask how long it had been happening. She asked if I was sure. She asked if I might have misunderstood. She asked if I realized what an accusation like that could do to a family. I felt myself shrinking as she spoke. Each question felt less like concern and more like a warning. And then she said the sentence that changed everything. I already knew, she said quietly. I just didn't think it was that serious. The words landed softly, but they crushed something inside me. I remember staring at her, waiting for her to explain, waiting for her to say she had stopped it, waiting for her to say she was protecting me. She didn't. Instead, she leaned back and folded her arms, like the conversation was nearly over. He would never mean to hurt you, she said. He's been through a lot. You're sensitive. Sensitive. That word erased everything I had just said. I tried again. My voice shook now. I was scared, I told her. I still am. She looked at me for a long time. Then she spoke carefully, choosing her words the way people do when they know exactly what they're doing. Talking about this will ruin lives, she said. Do you really want that on your conscience? That was when I understood the choice she was offering. Silence or guilt. Family or myself. She told me people wouldn't understand, that they would judge, that once something like this was said out loud, it could never be taken back. And then she said it. This stays in this house, not as a request, as a rule. She reminded me of everything she had done for me, of how hard she worked, of how fragile our family already was. I realized then that she wasn't asking if I was okay. She was asking if I would cooperate. When I didn't answer right away, her tone hardened. "If you love this family," she said, "you'll let this go." That was the moment my childhood ended. Not because of what he did, but because of what my mother chose not to do. I nodded. I agreed. I swallowed every word I still wanted to say, and as she went back to sorting her mail, relieved, I understood something terrifying. She wasn't protecting me from him. She was protecting herself from the truth, and she expected me to help her do it. After that conversation, nothing was said out loud, but everything changed. The house didn't feel louder. It felt tighter, like every wall had learned how to listen. My mother acted as if we had reached an understanding. She smiled more. She relaxed. She spoke about the future like the past had never existed. And I learned what silence really cost. There were new rules, even if no one named them. I was never to be alone. I was never to bring anything up. I was never to look uncomfortable when he was around. If I did, my mother noticed. Not with concern, with correction. She would clear her throat, change the subject, give me a look that said, "Not now." And when we were alone, she reminded me, "Don't make things awkward. People will notice. You're imagining tension that isn't there." Each time she said it, I felt myself move further away from my own reality. He continued to be welcomed, continued to be praised, continued to be defended. In front of others, my mother spoke about him warmly. She laughed at his jokes. She thanked him for helping. She talked about how trustworthy he was. Once someone asked if I was comfortable with him being around so much. Before I could answer, my mother smiled and said, "She's always been dramatic." The word hung in the air, light, casual, and everyone laughed. That was the moment I realized something important. She wasn't just asking me to stay silent. She was actively rewriting the story. My discomfort became my flaw. My fear became my personality problem, and she was very good at it. At home, she monitored my behavior closely. If I avoided him, she noticed. If I looked uneasy, she noticed. "You're being rude," she said once. "He hasn't done anything wrong." I stopped trusting my instincts, stopped reacting, stopped feeling at least on the surface, because belonging in that house came with a condition. I had to play my role, the obedient child, the grateful one, the one who didn't disrupt the balance. Some nights, I lay awake listening to my own breathing, wondering how something so wrong could be treated like something so small. I wondered if I was weak, if stronger people handled these things better, if silence really was the mature choice. My mother believed it was. She believed families survived because someone was willing to absorb the damage quietly. She believed that person should be me. There were moments when I almost broke. Moments when I thought about telling someone else, a teacher, a friend's parent. But my mother had already planted the fear. People will look at you differently. They'll never see you the same, and they'll blame me. That last part always stopped me. I didn't want to be the reason she was hurt, even though I was already hurting. So I stayed. I stayed quiet. I stayed polite. I stayed invisible. And with every day that passed, my silence grew heavier. Not because it was hard to keep, but because it was teaching me something dangerous. That my pain mattered less than keeping the peace. That love meant compliance. That family loyalty meant self-erasure. By the time I realized how deeply that belief had settled into me, it was already shaping who I was becoming. And my mother, she slept peacefully, because as long as I said nothing, everything was exactly the way she wanted it to be. Leaving home was supposed to fix everything. That's what I told myself. I thought distance would loosen the knots. That once I was gone, the memories would lose their grip. That silence belonged to that house, not to me. I was wrong. I left quietly. No confrontation, no dramatic goodbye. My mother helped me pack. She gave advice, She reminded me to call. To anyone watching it, looked like support. But beneath it was an unspoken agreement. I was allowed to leave. I just wasn't allowed to take the truth with me. At first, the freedom felt real. New routines, new walls, a life where I could close the door and feel safe. But silence has a way of traveling. It follows you into new rooms. It settles into your habits. I avoided closeness. I avoided questions. Any conversation that drifted too close to the past made my chest tighten. And every time my mother called, she reminded me of the rules. Don't dwell on old things. You're doing so well now. Let's focus on the good. If I sounded tired, she said I was working too much. If I sounded distant, she said I was overthinking. She never asked how I was healing, only whether I was behaving. Over time, her calls became less about connection and more about reassurance. Reassurance that I was still cooperating, that I was still quiet. Sometimes she would mention him casually, a detail, a favor he had done. Each time she waited for my response. Not my opinion, my compliance. If I stayed neutral, she relaxed. If my voice changed even slightly, she corrected me. "You're reading into things again," she said once. "You've always done that." I began to understand something unsettling. Distance hadn't threatened her control. It had refined it. She didn't need me in the house anymore. She just needed me to stay aligned with her version of the story. There were moments when I considered breaking the silence, telling someone, anyone. But years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. I had learned to measure the consequences before speaking, to calculate who would be hurt, who would be blamed. And somehow the answer was always me. Then life moved forward as it does. Work, relationships, responsibilities. On the surface, I was functioning, successful even. But inside, something stayed locked. A part of me that never learned how to speak without fear. I realized I was still living by my mother's rules, even miles away. The silence she taught me had become my instinct. The most painful part wasn't that she checked on me. It was how she did it. She framed her control as concern, her reminders as love. And when I tried gently to set boundaries, she reacted quickly. "You're changing," she said. "You're forgetting where you come from." The message was clear. Independence was acceptable, but only up to a point. As long as I didn't challenge the past, as long as I didn't name what had happened, as long as I didn't ask for accountability. I began to see the pattern then, not just in my family, but in myself. I had left the house, but I had carried the silence with me. And without realizing it, I was still protecting her. There was a moment when everything almost changed. Not because I planned it, not because I was brave, but because silence slipped. It happened during a family gathering, one of those events my mother insisted on, even years after I had left home. "It's important," she said. "People will ask where you are." So I went. The house was full, voices overlapping, laughter rising and falling like waves. From the outside, it looked warm, connected, normal. And for a while, I managed. I smiled. I nodded. I played my part. But something about being back there unsettled me in a way I hadn't expected. The familiar walls, the familiar smells. And then I saw him. He hadn't changed much. Still confident, still comfortable. He greeted me like nothing had ever happened. That was when I felt it. That old tightening in my chest. That instinctive pull toward the exit. I stepped outside to breathe. Just for a moment. Someone followed me. Not him. A relative. Someone kind. Someone who noticed. They asked how I was really doing. It was a simple question. A harmless one. But it landed differently. For a second, I considered telling the truth. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to finally let the weight shift. And before I could stop myself, my voice cracked. "I don't feel safe here," I said. The words hung in the air. Quiet, dangerous. I hadn't named him. I hadn't explained. But it was enough. They looked at me carefully. concern replacing small talk. "What do you mean?" they asked. And in that moment, I knew if I kept speaking, everything would change. Before I could answer, my mother appeared. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She simply placed herself between us. "What's going on?" she asked, smiling. I hesitated. That hesitation told her everything. She turned to the other person and laughed softly. "Oh, she gets overwhelmed at these things," she said. "She always has." Then she took my arm. Firm, controlled. "Come help me inside," she said quietly. Her fingers tightened, just enough to remind me. Later, when we were alone, her tone changed. "I heard what you said," she told me. "You need to be careful." I told her I hadn't meant to cause trouble, that I was just tired. She didn't accept that. "You can't say things like that," she said. "People start asking questions." There it was, not concern for me, concern for exposure. She reminded me of everything again. The family, the consequences, the damage. And then she said something that chilled me. "If you say anything," she said slowly, "you won't just hurt him. You'll hurt me." That was the threat, wrapped in vulnerability, delivered as truth. I felt the old instinct rise, the need to protect her, to absorb the cost. So I backed down. I told her she was right, that I was emotional, that I would be more careful. She relaxed immediately. The crisis in her mind was over, but something inside me had shifted, because for the first time, I saw it clearly. She wasn't afraid of losing me. She was afraid of losing control, and she had been managing that control for years, quietly, efficiently. The truth hadn't come out that day, but it had come close enough to scare her. And from that moment on, I knew something important. If I ever spoke again, she would not stand beside me. She would stand in my way. Not long after that gathering, my mother's world began to shrink. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. First, it was small things, missed appointments, calls late at night, a tone in her voice I hadn't heard before, fear. She told me she was tired, that her body wasn't cooperating the way it used to, that people she had relied on were suddenly busy, including him. The irony didn't escape me, but I didn't say anything. I came when she called. I listened. I helped, because no matter how complicated things were, she was still my mother. And for a brief moment, I thought, maybe this was it. Maybe this was when things would finally change. She needed me now, really needed me. I drove her to appointments. I sat beside her in waiting rooms. I organized paperwork she no longer had the energy to face. People praised me for it. "She's lucky to have you," they said. She did something right. I smiled, but inside, I waited. I waited for her to acknowledge the past, to say something, anything, but she never did. Instead, she spoke as if nothing had ever happened, as if our relationship had always been simple, healthy. When I was exhausted, she called it dedication. When I was quiet, she called it maturity. One evening, as I was preparing to leave, she looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and expectation. "You'll stay a bit longer next time," she said. Not a question. I hesitated. She noticed. Her voice softened, but her words sharpened. "After everything I've done for you," she said, "this is the least you can do." There it was again, that familiar pressure. I told her I needed balance, that I had my own life now. Her expression changed instantly. "I protected this family," she said. "I kept things together when they could have fallen apart." She looked at me carefully, measuring the impact of her next words. "You owe me." The sentence hit harder than any accusation ever could. She wasn't asking for help. She was collecting a debt she believed I had accumulated by surviving quietly. I realized then that her need didn't soften her expectations. It intensified them. She expected my presence, my care, my continued silence, and she expected it without apology. When I gently suggested we talk about the past, her reaction was swift. "Why would you bring that up now?" she asked. Can't you see what I'm dealing with?" The message was clear. Her pain mattered. Mine was inconvenient. Again, I left that night feeling heavier than I had in years, because something fundamental had cracked. I had hoped that need would bring honesty, that vulnerability would open a door. Instead, it revealed the truth more clearly than ever. She didn't need forgiveness. She needed compliance. And as I drove home, a realization settled over me. If I continued like this, nothing would ever change. She would take my help, my time, my silence, and she would never take responsibility. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for decades. What would happen if I stopped protecting her? That question didn't bring relief. It brought fear, but it also brought something else, clarity. And once clarity arrives, it doesn't leave quietly. I didn't plan the confrontation. It happened because I stopped avoiding it. There comes a point when pretending costs more than truth, when carrying everything alone becomes heavier than the consequences of letting it out. That point came quietly. My mother had asked me to come over again. Another appointment, another favor. I agreed, but something in me felt different this time. I wasn't angry. I wasn't emotional. I was tired of carrying a story that wasn't mine to protect. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had told her years ago, the same one where she had chosen silence. She talked about logistics, about schedules, about what she needed next. And then she paused. "You've been distant," she said. "What's going on with you?" I took a breath. A real one. "I can't keep doing this," I said. "Not like this." She frowned, confused, defensive. "Doing what?" "Pretending," I said. Pretending nothing happened. The air changed immediately. Her posture stiffened. Her eyes hardened. "I don't know why you insist on reopening things," she said. "That was a long time ago." I nodded. "It was," I said, "and it never stopped affecting me." She shook her head slowly. "You're choosing to hold on to pain," she replied. "I chose to move forward." That was when something inside me finally broke free. "You didn't move forward," I said quietly. "You stepped over me." Her face tightened. "I did what I had to do," she said. "You have no idea how hard that was for me." For her, that word echoed in my head. I looked at her, then really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a child. "I know you knew," I said. "I know you chose not to stop it." She opened her mouth to interrupt me. I didn't let her. "You asked me to stay silent," I continued. "You told me it was for the family, but it was for you." Her voice rose. "You're being unfair," she said. "You're rewriting the past." I shook my head. "No," I said. "I finally stopped rewriting it for you." There was a long silence. Then she said the sentence I had never expected to hear. I chose what was easier for me. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She just said it, like a confession, without remorse. "I couldn't handle the fallout," she continued. "I couldn't live with what people would think." There it was, the truth, bare, unpolished. I felt something strange in that moment. Not rage, not satisfaction, relief, because there was no more doubt, no more wondering if she had misunderstood, no more hoping she would someday see it differently. She had seen it clearly all along. "And what about me?" I asked. "What was I supposed to do?" She hesitated. "You were strong," she said. "You survived." Survived. As if that was the goal. As if survival without protection was a gift. I stood up then. Not dramatically, just decisively. "I did survive," I said. "But I'm done sacrificing myself, so you don't have to feel uncomfortable." Her voice sharpened. "If you walk away now," she said, "don't expect things to be the same." I met her eyes. "They already aren't," I replied. For the first time in my life, I didn't wait for permission. I didn't negotiate. I didn't soften the truth. I picked up my keys and walked out. Behind me, she stayed seated, not because she didn't care, but because she had finally lost the one thing she relied on most, my silence. Walking away didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief, not for what was lost, but for what never existed. I didn't cut contact immediately. That would have been easier to explain, easier to justify. Instead, I changed the terms. I stopped explaining myself, stopped correcting her version of events, stopped stepping in when she felt uncomfortable. The silence shifted. For the first time, it wasn't mine. She called less often. When she did, her words were careful, measured. She tested the old patterns, the guilt, the reminders, but they didn't land the same way. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I simply didn't engage. That confused her more than anger ever could, because for years, she had relied on my reaction, my reassurance, my willingness to absorb tension. Without that, she didn't know how to position herself. There were moments when I felt the pull to go back, to soften, to fix. That instinct doesn't disappear overnight, but something else had changed. I had named the truth, and once you do that, you can't unknow it. I noticed how much lighter my days felt. Not easier, just quieter. I slept better. I spoke more honestly in other relationships. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. The silence that once trapped me was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar: choice. My mother, on the other hand, grew more distant, not because I punished her, but because she no longer knew how to control the narrative. She wasn't losing me in a dramatic way. She was losing access, and that was something she had never prepared for. There was no final apology, no emotional reconciliation, just a slow realization on her part that the child she taught to stay quiet had learned how to speak by walking away. I didn't expose her. I didn't seek revenge. I simply stopped participating in the lie. And that was enough. What surprised me most was the peace that followed. Not happiness, not closure. Peace. The kind that comes when you stop waiting for someone else to validate your pain. I understood then that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconnection, and healing doesn't require permission. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave without explaining yourself one last time. My mother protected what was easiest for her. I protected what was left of me. And for the first time, that choice didn't come with guilt. It came with clarity. And that clarity stayed. As someone who has spent years working with families, trauma, and long-term emotional wounds, I want to say something very clearly. What happened here was not a misunderstanding. It was not a failure of communication. And it was not the result of someone being too sensitive. It was a choice. When a parent knows their child is being harmed and chooses silence, that silence becomes a form of participation. Not because they caused the harm, but because they allowed it to continue. Many parents justify this choice by telling themselves they are protecting the family, protecting stability, protecting reputation. But what they are really protecting is their own comfort. Children who are asked to stay silent learn a dangerous lesson early in life. That love is conditional. That belonging must be earned through compliance. That their pain is negotiable. And those lessons don't disappear with age. They show up in adulthood as guilt, as difficulty setting boundaries, as a lifelong habit of minimizing one's own needs to keep others at ease. Healing doesn't begin with confrontation. It begins with clarity. Clarity that what happened was real, that it mattered, and that silence was a survival response, not a moral failure. Walking away emotionally or physically is not abandonment. Sometimes it is the first act of self-respect. Forgiveness, when it comes, should never be demanded, and reconciliation is not a requirement for healing. Some relationships are not meant to be repaired. They are meant to be understood and released. If this story resonated with you, it may be because part of it reflects your own experience. And if that's the case, I want you to remember this. You are not cruel for protecting yourself. You are not disloyal for telling the truth. And you do not owe anyone your silence. If stories like this help you feel seen, understood, or less alone, I invite you to support this channel. Liking this video helps these stories reach others who may need them, and subscribing ensures that even when life gets busy, these conversations will still be here for you when you return. We share these stories not to reopen wounds, but to remind people that healing is possible. Thank you for staying until the end, and remember, your voice matters even when it was once taken from you.